This video presents research by the Wales Centre for Public Policy on the role of communities and the use of technology in addressing loneliness during the coronavirus pandemic. It outlines key learning from the experience of 71 individuals involved in over 50 informal or small-scale formal community groups across Wales. The research explored the effect their involvement had on experiences of loneliness, the role that online and offline technology played, and how this kind of community action could be sustained, enabled and enhanced into recovery. This is part 1 of 3 videos, and it looks at key learning on the role of communities in addressing loneliness. The pandemic response of the community groups involved in this research was just the tip of an iceberg of community action and interaction. Like a lot of other studies on the community response to COVID have found, key was what this visible part told us about the less visible or less looked at base. These buzzing underwater ecosystems, communities' existing networks and the wider systems they're part of, where they're more or less established, why they are, how they might appear in the first place, and how they might be strengthened, expanded, or mobilised elsewhere. Our research involved in-depth interviews with over 70 members and coordinators of over 50 community groups, reflecting socio-economic and geographical diversity across all 22 Welsh local authorities, as well as the specific experiences of groups identified by research as more likely to experience loneliness, like disabled people, young people, older people, or Black, Asian and minority ethnic people. Some of the groups involved had formed on the basis of location, and these place-based groups were mainly COVID response groups, so new but often formed by people, groups and networks already active in the community. And some groups had formed on the basis of shared interest, identity or experience. These interest-based groups were mainly existing groups that formed part of these base networks but had shifted their focus to supporting their communities through the pandemic. Almost all of the groups involved were informal or smaller scale formal groups, so just one layer of this complex landscape of multiple actors, both in terms of the COVID response and community action more generally. So this research in no way represents this whole picture, but it aims to highlight learning from specific experiences within a small slice of it. None of the place-based groups in this research set out specifically to tackle loneliness. Most set up with the first national lockdown to meet emergency need by delivering food and prescriptions to people shielding. Lots did wider activities alongside this, from dog walking to doorstep yoga, and the majority also developed dedicated wellbeing support systems, like buddy calls and befriending. While these were considered important in tackling loneliness, overwhelming emphasis was placed on the impact of practical, task-based activities. Getting help with shopping or prescriptions provided a simple, low-pressure, accessible way into social interaction by shifting focus away from it, which is key given that people who feel lonely can find social interaction difficult, both as a cause or a consequence of that loneliness. And it was key to breaking down those barriers to both asking for and offering help that particularly surround mental health. As practical interactions around shopping or prescription delivery were repeated, they often shifted from transactional to more emotional, which built new relationships and accessible networks around people. It didn't require fitting into existing networks, like joining a club or group, which can be or feel inaccessible for some people, and often worsen the cycle of loneliness. So physical, practical stuff like delivering food or furniture, or finding hot cross buns at Christmas, led to genuine friendships, which built on wider networks or a sense of community, the feeling for everyone involved of having a support structure, feeling thought of, known about, or part of something, which often stuck around even where COVID response groups are wound down or finished. This gives a glimpse of how community networks might be built in the first place. These nodes, physical stuff mobilised by a sense of purpose, created connections that built into relationships, and it highlights the potential for tackling loneliness. We're focusing on these tangible means of social interaction, not just the elusive ends of relationships or networks, the connections themselves. Just like focusing on being happy isn't always the best way to tackle depression. But a key and widespread question is how these new community networks might be sustained or replicated when the shared emergency purpose they were founded on is gone. Findings from interest-based groups highlight possibilities for addressing this, showing the same model of network building works outside of a crisis context. Things to do, sports, arts, leisure and culture, and places to do them, physical and digital infrastructures, were all key in building these base community networks that often, but not always, provided the foundations for crisis response and related to geographic and socioeconomic factors in complex ways. These are still networks created by physical stuff mobilised by a sense of purpose, but this purpose comes from shared interests, experiences, campaigning for something you care about, or photography, or knitting, and our findings suggest that the networks built as a result are often better at tackling loneliness because they're more sustainable and more mutual, not built around a help divide. A key theme in the research was that having meaningful stuff to do wasn't just important for mobilising connections and networks that prevent loneliness, but for addressing loneliness directly. Many participants emphasised the power and importance of having a sense of purpose or drive in tackling loneliness, not feeling bored or empty, rather than just socialising per se. This again highlights the importance of having meaningful things to do, and it opens potential for approaches to tackling loneliness that don't necessarily require getting out and joining a club. These may or may not be longer term goals, but as the COVID response groups show, there's a clear need for more accessible steps to engagement alongside them. This was echoed by interest-based group participants who highlighted difficulties around joining groups or clubs, again often a cause or consequence of their loneliness. It was overcome by building that framework, providing stepping stones through practical activities with the option, not expectation, of social interaction, like activities coordinated online, where you can take part without switching on a camera or microphone, or even leaving home. And key alongside this action was having very structured spaces for social interaction, so being brought in, being asked, providing a clear framework for getting involved and staying involved, breaking down those huge barriers to just turning up, let alone talking. So in terms of sustaining community action to address loneliness and more, all this suggests the need to shift attention from the tip of the iceberg, the pandemic response, to the base, communities' long-term underwater networks, the meaningful stuff to do and places to do it, the libraries, community centres, sports clubs that have often been ravaged by the pandemic, but we know are also the foundations and future of community connections. The tip of the iceberg is melting, and it already has to an extent, which isn't a problem, but a success. The COVID response groups in this research had done what they set out to do and much more. Many have wound down, and those that remain have already shifted to different, longer-term focus. So key in moving forwards will be celebrating the pandemic response, but recognising it as part of a much bigger picture, letting it melt away, while ensuring it doesn't crumble off the edge in the process, but reinforces the base, communities' existing networks, with the new ones that have been created, and by learning from their experience. The potential of focusing on the means of social connection, stuff to do and a sense of purpose, rather than the ends, the connection itself, both as a more tangible basis for building and sustaining community networks through preventative infrastructures, and for providing accessible stepping stones into these through more directed, responsive approaches for those who might already be or feel disconnected for a huge range of reasons. For more detail on these findings, you can download our report here, or on the Wales Centre for Public Policy website. And don't forget to watch part 2 for our findings on how groups develop blended approaches to addressing loneliness with online and offline technologies.
For more information about our research, visit our website, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the bell to get an email when new videos are released.